I'm Shaun Haney, and this is RealAg on the Weekend. Let's get real and get connected with the week that was in Canadian agriculture. RealAg on the Weekend starts now. Welcome to RealAg on the Weekend. I'm your host, Shaun Haney of RealAgriculture.com. Hopefully you had yourself a great week on the farm, the ranch, in your livestock barns, and you're tuning in here today on this Saturday afternoon. It is great to have you here. Looking forward to today's show of RealAg on the Weekend here on 980 CGME and 650 CKOM. It is great to be broadcasting across Saskatchewan to all of our Real Agriculture audience here on Rolco's stations. Fantastic stuff. Okay, today we're gonna cover a number of different topics that are kind of a wide variety, and that's one of the things you always get with RealAgriculture.com is that it's a wide swath, so to speak, of content. So we're going to hear from Dwayne Summach. He is a livestock and feed extension specialist with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture. We're going to talk about on your bred heifers, what about supplementing some canola meal, rid of that protein boost? So we'll hear from him on that. We're also going to hear a piece, just a sliver of a conversation that I had with Jacob Shapiro of Cognitive Investments based out of New Orleans, Louisiana. He's a geopolitical expert, and we talk about a whole bunch of things in a broader interview that is posted at realagriculture.com. But I'm going to play a clip for you that I think you're going to want to definitely pay some attention to as it applies to Russia and Ukraine. And we're also going to hear from Jeremy Boychyn of Alberta Wheat and Barley Commission, talking about PGR timing on your wheat. And we're also going to hear from Chris Davison from the Canola Council of Canada, talking about a few trade issues relative to canola and what Canada is up to, why they're getting involved in the middle of a skirmish between the U.S. and Mexico on GM corn. If you have any feedback on today's show, we'd love to hear from you. Send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com, or, of course, you can always follow us across all the different social media platforms and interact. We are Real Agriculture on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, as well as TikTok. And I also want to mention the RealAg feedback line. Now, you dial this number, you press the number 3, and you leave me a message. It is 855-776-6147. Okay, let's get into my conversation with Dwayne Summach. He's with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture. He spoke this week, actually, at the Saskatchewan Stock Growers annual meeting in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. Talked to the group about the potential for supplementing canola meal in the fall with your bred heifers. Here's the conversation.
So the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Association undertook a ADOPT project, or agricultural demonstration of practices and technologies. And that project occurred at a couple different locations. One was the Circle Y Ranch down at Big Beaver. The other was the Cedar Lee Ranch at Hodgeville. And I reported on that last year to them. Last year was kind of the first year. And during that report, then somebody went, well, we need to do this ongoing. And so we continued it again this year. We ran into a little bit of trouble at Hodgeville. It was a little bit drier and they didn't have the grass growth. And so they didn't have the ability to continue on and do it again. So we were down to just the one location. And so that's why it's the continuing chronicles. It's what's the next year of the story. But Michael Burgess at the Circle Y has been supplementing bred heifers at the Circle Y for many years.
Okay.
And so this really just forced him to capture some data and prove to himself why he's been doing this. And so it's about feeding a little bit of canola meal. We're supplementing some protein to some cattle, to the bred heifers as they're grazing dormant native grass pasture there. And we're just feeding them a little bit. We feed it to them every other day. He delivers it mixed with salt so that the salt is used to limit intake. And so the results are actually pretty interesting. A little bit of supplementation goes a long way. And so this year, the results were his bred heifers that didn't receive any canola meal lost about 0.8 pounds a day. And the cattle that did receive the canola meal gained about 0.8 of a pound a day.
Oh, wow.
So you're getting to be a pretty wide discrepancy. And this is a class of cattle, your bred heifers, you want to be gaining. So it's pretty important, right? But we were feeding at 1.5 kilos every 2 days, which when you do the math, it's probably more than we needed to be feeding them. But I mean, it made quite a difference.
It's interesting here because, one, based on the intended increase to canola crush capacity in a province like Saskatchewan, we're going to have a lot more meal to deal with. Now, we can export that meal, or we can, of course, use it domestically. So there's going to be a supply out there. This is one of the ways that we could be using it. For me, I hear a lot about feeding canola meal to dairy animals. There's marketing campaigns from the Canola Council and when you go to a U.S. dairy show about that. Not as much on the beef side. Is my perception there real?
It's founded.
Okay.
They definitely have targeted the dairy industry, as canola meal is a high quality protein, and the dairy industry buys protein supplement. And so they've recognized that as a targeted industry, a place where it can be fed, and it does a lot of really good things in the dairy. On the beef side, we would feed a lot less, but we got a lot more animals to feed it to. And so, but price has been an issue, right? And on the dairy side, well, price is always still an issue. There's cash flow to deal with it, right? If it makes sense, it can be used. Where on the beef side, sometimes it's just, that's an expense I'm not sure I can justify, but that's part of why we do these types of demonstrations, is to help take the risk out of it and be able to actually capture some numbers. And the numbers on it this year, it was basically the way Michael had it done up. It cost him about $1,350 a ton for his supplementation. Now you can divide that by the 1.5 kilos a day, and or every other day, you can back it up to what the cost per head per day is. But it wasn't little amounts, but when you look at, can we supplement and keep them on pasture for less than we can feed them in the dry lot for, right? And that's where we're going with this.
Do you think, based on a couple of years of experience here in this demonstration, do you think this is a practice that we could see a lot more of going forward in Saskatchewan and across the prairies?
I think it's going to become a tool in the toolbox to help extend the grazing season. It will not be something that we can say we're going to do this and it's going to take our bred heifers to December 15th. It's going to be one of those tools that we can use. And when it snows, if the snow gets too deep, the cattle start grazing. Now we got to move to another one. But it can get us the next 2 or 3 weeks pretty easy. Might even get us an extra 2 months. And so I can see where it's gonna, this is not new technology, right? This is something that producers in the Nebraska Sandhills, this is kind of how they winter their cows, right? Is they get them through on cottonseed milk cake or some type of protein supplement. And so really we're just taking that concept and can we stretch out our grazing season every 2 or 3 weeks we can get, helps us, right? And so is it a strategy that we can use? Absolutely.
Have you been supplementing canola meal for your bred heifers? We'd love to hear from you. What's been your experience? Have you had success with it? What are some of is there some negatives to it that you've experienced? The what to do and what not to do. We'd love to hear from you. Send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. Let's take a break. We'll be right back on RealAg on the weekend here on 980 CGME and 650 CKOM.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Smith of RealAgriculture.com. Join me Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern for The Agronomists, Canada's only live, interactive, agronomy-based show. Each week, we answer your most pressing questions with a rotating panel of agronomists, researchers, and extension staff from across Canada. Join me Monday nights, 8 p.m. Eastern on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn, or head to realagriculture.com/live at 8 p.m. Eastern.
If you're involved in the agriculture industry, it's important to stay informed on all the latest issues affecting your business. At RealAgriculture.com, we offer fast, reliable news, information, and insights to help you keep on top of all of the latest in Canadian agriculture. Visit RealAgriculture.com and sign up for our free daily newsletter covering everything from news, agronomy, animal agriculture, and much more. Visit RealAgriculture.com/subscribe today.
One of the cool things about my job, being a radio show host and getting to talk to so many people across agriculture and all the different verticals and genres of ag, and it's such high amount of diversification, is you get to talk to some people that are exceptionally smarter than yourself, right? And the next conversation is with Jacob Shapiro of Cognitive Investments, and I kind of got to know Jacob over the past year. He writes a weekly column that you can find at Grain Fox, and I encourage you to check that out. But what we're starting to do is every month, Jacob and I do a discussion, and we did one this week, about geopolitics and relate it back to American and Canadian farmers. And he is phenomenal. I really like chatting with Jacob. And we recorded one this week, and we're going to post it at realagriculture.com. So you watch out for that. And I'm going to play you a piece of that conversation where we talk about what's going on with the war in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia. And are we getting any closer, or are we getting further away from a conclusion to this conflict? Because it's got big impacts on the grain market.
Well, let me start with a joke, Shaun, that sort of relates directly to the grain deal, which is there's a guy walking down the street and he passes by an insane asylum, and he just hears from the yard. He can't see into it, but he hears from the yard. They're all chanting 21, 21, 21 at the top of their lungs, and curiosity gets the better of him. So he goes up. He can't see. It's blocked off by some kind of screen, but he sees there's a narrow slit here where if he can just get to the narrow slit, he can get in. 21 in the background. So he gets to the narrow slit. He looks in, and boom, a stick pokes him in the eye. And then they all start chanting 22, 22, 22.
Yeah.
I say that to say with the Black Sea grain deal, I mean, as soon as Russia approves every single extension, then Lavrov is out there saying, well, we really don't like this deal, though, and next time we really aren't going to approve it. And he did that just last week. And I have trouble taking it seriously. But the flip side of that is the moment that you stop taking him seriously will probably be the moment that Russia withdraws from the deal, right? I think the thing to think about with the Black Sea Grain Initiative in particular is that Russia tried to pull out in November, and not the Western countries, every other country in the world, your Brazils and South Africas and your Indias, all of those countries which for various pragmatic reasons, which we can get into if you want, have not condemned Russia's war or are not putting political pressure on Russia. All of them said, hey, you're increasing food prices a lot if you're going to do this. We're not cool with that. You need to stick with the Black Sea Grain Initiative. So Russia doesn't have Europe anymore. It doesn't have the United States. It can't piss off the rest of the world by leaving the Black Sea Grain Initiative. So I think there's that constraint in place. The other thing is we had Turkish elections. Erdogan won, and Russia trusts Erdogan to, well, not trust is the wrong word, but they know that Erdogan is a pragmatist and that Erdogan is going to deal with them on a pragmatic basis. Whereas the Turkish opposition was really talking about, no, we're going to rejoin with NATO and the West, and we're going to do everything the opposite of what Erdogan is doing. All of which is to say Turkey is the real guarantor of that deal. And now that they have Erdogan in place, I expect that the Black Sea Grain Initiative will probably remain in place. But zooming out for a bit with the Russia-Ukraine war itself, for the first 5-6 months of the year, it's been relatively quiet. If you're paying attention to the war, there was the grisly battle for Bakhmut. You could pay attention to some of these, missile strikes and drone strikes here and what's happening. But it really has been, I don't want to say not an active conflict, but it hasn't been sort of at the level that it was this time last year. And all of that is because Ukraine is preparing for this counteroffensive against Russian forces. And what I would tell listeners is that I think we're finally getting in to where that counteroffensive is going to happen. You probably know at the beginning of this week, there was that dam that was destroyed in southeastern Ukraine. I can't say for certain who did it, but I would guess it's the Russians, because the only reason you would break that dam is because you're afraid that Ukrainian forces are going to try to cross the river there so that they can cut off access to Crimea, because that's the land bridge to Crimea right there. And I think Russia's showing you when it's back against the wall, when it's not doing well in the war, when it's now facing a new offensive from Ukraine that has new promises and commitments from Germany and the United States for an indefinite supply of weapons, the types of things that they're going to be willing to do to make sure that they can defend themselves from this Ukrainian offensive. And the result of it is, how many tens of thousands of people displaced, how many millions of tons of crops in Ukraine destroyed. I mean, this is really, I think, just the beginning of a more active kinetic phase of this conflict. So sort of forget about the calm that we've had for the last 6 to 7 months. I think that's where we're going. I would also tell you, though, and this is the flip side, I was arguing about this with another geopolitical strategist named Marco Papic, if your listeners have heard of him. He thinks there's not going to be a counteroffensive. He thinks it's all a big dog and pony show to try and get political and economic support, because he thinks an offensive would be suicide, because he thinks the Russian bombers and fighters are just going to bomb Ukrainian forces across the border. I don't think that's correct, but that could be out there too. And if I'm wrong, we'll get to August and September and you'll have me back on and I'll be like, well, I guess that offensive didn't happen and Marco was correct. But if I was a Canadian farmer, I'd be looking for, how is this war going to get worse? How is it going to affect grain availability? What other things is Russia going to do when its back is against the wall that might affect global grain prices? Because that, I think, is the center of gravity, at least for Canadian farmers in the context of what's going on.
Is there any reason for Russia to sort of walk away from this? It hasn't gone as, at least we thought it was going to go, and people have speculated the way they thought it was going to go. Is there any way they save face and just sort of say, well, that was fun, and kind of go home? Or are we setting in for, however intense the fighting is, however large a counteroffensive is, yes or no, this is just the way it is for the years to come?
There is every reason in the world for Russia to walk away from this. There was also every reason in the world for Russia not to do this. And I thought they weren't going to do it because I thought they were aware of all the reasons. This, I really think, comes down to Putin's regime. I think Putin has gone too far. I don't think he can turn back here. He has put too much of his credibility, too much of his future is based on success of this war. The question is, how long are the Russian people and how long is the Russian state around Putin going to tolerate continued failures here? Because, the Russian economy has held up remarkably well, all things considered. But if oil prices are going to continue to swoon, if the Europeans and the Americans are going to continue to tighten sanctions, I mean, the Russians think that the Europeans are eventually going to start importing natural gas from them. They're not. That's just wrong. The strategy is wrong and Russia's not reversing course. So whether that happens in 6 months, whether it happens in 12 months, I thought it would have already happened already. But there's obviously every reason for Russia to stop because it looks like they're going to lose. If, I alluded to this already, but just a couple weeks ago, Germany came out and said, all right, we're going to have 3 billion euros of worth of weapons that we're going to deliver to Ukraine. And we're going to start JVs in Ukraine so that they can learn how to service their own tanks and build their own tanks and things like that. And to put that in perspective, 3 billion euros worth of weapons from Germany, that's more than they've sent Ukraine in the entire conflict so far. And when this war started, a month before the war started, and Ukraine was warning that Russia was going to invade, I don't know if your listeners remember this. I remember it because the Germans said, all right, we're going to send 5,000 helmets to Ukraine. We don't want to send offensive weapons, but they might need the helmets. So we've gone from Germany sending helmets to, hey, we're setting up companies on the ground in Ukraine that can service the tanks that we're going to give them. That doesn't work for Russia. Russia's in a fight that it really can't win. So it has every reason to walk away. And as long as Putin is in control, they probably won't.
You ever get committed to a decision where you're so committed, you're in so deep, it's like, well, we can't go back now. It's exactly what Jacob Shapiro of Cognitive Investments is talking about when it comes to Russia and the Ukraine war. We'd love your opinion on that. What's your perspective? Send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. We'll be right back on Real Ag on the Weekend here on 980 CGME and 650 CKOM.
The next generation is the future of agriculture, but how do we launch from one role to leading? From succession planning and family dynamics to understanding finances and making the tough calls to discovering paths others have taken all through agriculture, the Successors Podcast covers it all. Tune in with me, your host, Kara Oosterhuis, simply by searching The Successors on your favorite podcast platform, or you can find it by visiting www.realagriculture.com.
Canola is more than just a pretty face in the prairie landscape. It's a big business, both here and around the world, that requires you to be informed and up to date on everything it takes to grow a successful crop. The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com has an expert library of video resources covering markets, agronomy, and more to help you grow a healthy and profitable canola crop. Visit canolaschool.com today. Brought to you by BASF Canada and Invigor Hybrid Canola.
Whether you're seeding, harvesting, or anything in between, the Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com has you covered. Timely agronomic information from industry experts available online anytime. Give your wheat crop a good start and a great finish with the Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com. Brought to you by C&M Seeds, Syngenta Canada, and the Alberta Wheat and Barley Commission.
One of the tools or technologies that is being used a lot more, I think, across the prairies due to some products being registered is plant growth regulators. And in a recent Wheat School episode, and the Wheat School is brought to you by Syngenta Canada, C&M Seeds, and Alberta Wheat and Barley Commissions. You can find more episodes by going to wheatschool.com. We hear from Jeremy Boychyn of Alberta Wheat and Barley Commission talking about the proper application of PGR to lead to that really, really high level of effectiveness.
And we are here to talk about PGR decisions. So this is a decision that's coming up every year now. Should I be using PGRs? Am I in a situation where PGRs are going to be beneficial? And there's a few things we can think about to help make this decision. 5 factors that I want you to put in your notebook to help make this decision to make sure that when you're applying a PGR, you're getting the most out of it. First off is, what is the yield expectation of that crop? If you're headed in the 60, 70, 80 plus bushel range, that is the area where you're typically going to see more opportunity for lodging, and a PGR is going to be more beneficial. Secondly, we want to talk about history of that field. Does that field typically see lodging on it more years than not? If you're not seeing lodging on that field typically, maybe it's not the best place to spend your money. The third factor we want to talk about is variety selection. Each variety, first off, is going to respond differently to a PGR. So depending on your variety, you may have more or less response to a PGR application than a different variety. So just because you've seen response from one variety does not mean you'll see that same response from a different variety. So it's important to have strips and checks when you're using PGRs on new variety where you don't know if you're going to get a response. And the other factor to look at is, what is the actual lodging rating of that variety? Each variety is going to have a different lodging rating. If you look at your provincial seed guide, you will find the rating for that variety in there. If you're poor, fair, or good, and depending on where you are in the province and the pressure that you have of lodging on your crop and in your fields is going to depend on what those ratings mean to you. Because in one region where we have high pressure of lodging, a variety rated G may see lodging, but in another part of the province or another part of Western Canada, that G may be good enough to mitigate lodging in that scenario. So you're going to have to look closely and relate that back to what you've seen historically. And then the fourth thing we want to look at is how much rain we've actually received in May and then into June. Typically that PGR timing is right now, right at the beginning of June. We're getting into that 4 to 6 leaf staging. We're getting in that growth stage 30 to 32, splitting those stems. We've taken a look. We know that timing is appropriate. Have we got the moisture to attain that yield potential we've been targeting on that crop? That's a huge question, because if we haven't got it, we're not going to see that yield come around, and we're likely not going to see as much lodging or any lodging on that crop if we're not meeting that yield potential or close to that yield potential. So we have to remember, how much water do we need for our wheat crop? So in general, what we've seen, 4 to 5 inches of rain is going to get us to complete our vegetative phase of wheat. So if you know in your soil and your rainfall you've met that, then every additional inch of rain above and beyond that 4 to 5 inches is going to give you about 5 to 7 of additional bushels per inch of rain. So every inch, another 5, give or take, bushels on top of that. So keeping that in mind, how much rainfall have you received? What is your yield potential? What have you fertilized for? this is going to help get an idea of, are you reaching that yield potential? So which variety are we using? What rainfall conditions are we dealing with? And where are we at in terms of environmental conditions? Environmental conditions are going to play a huge role in this decision as well, because PGRs are a synthetic hormone. So when we spray this on the crop, it is acting in many ways on that crop, not just lodging. And it may affect a variety of different things, and it's affecting how that plant is growing. So if there's any additional stress that's happening to that crop, such as heat, such as frost, such as drought, it's going to add additional stress on that crop when you apply that PGR. And this can bring about quite a few challenges, and we saw this in 2021 when we had our heat dome, we had our drought stress scenario where we applied PGR, sometimes in cases where we shouldn't have been applying a PGR, and it had severe effects on our yield and on the development of those crops. So we really need to think about, have we seen stress recently as we're about to apply a PGR? And typically that question is, are we in drought conditions? Do we think that crop is stressed right now? Have we seen frost conditions? And generally it's been pretty warm this May, so maybe not a lot of situations where we have, but if you're getting close to that 0 degrees Celsius within about 5 days of application, that can add added stress. And then after that, are we expecting to see really high temperatures? Right now, it's supposed to be 29 degrees in Alberta. It's going to be hot. Spraying a PGR on this day could add additional stress onto that crop if you already are in low moisture conditions, and maybe if you've already applied a relatively hot herbicide close to that timing. So you may be putting in additional stress on that crop. So when we consider all of these factors, when we consider what's our yield potential, what's our variety, how much rainfall do we have, are we fertilizing for it, and which environmental conditions are we dealing with right now, if we take all of those into consideration and we're looking like we're getting to that yield potential, we have that rain, the variety is likely to lodge in high conditions, and we're not seeing stress environmentally, then we're good to go. Outside of that, we really need to be cautious about applying a PGR and maybe take a step back and ask the question of, is this really beneficial? Am I going to get my money back? Or is this going to add additional stress to my crop?
That was Jeremy Boychyn of Alberta Wheat and Barley Commission. You know, he references Alberta conditions there, but the same goes for Saskatchewan. You can apply that knowledge inside Saskatchewan as well. For those of you that have used PGRs, curious, what's been the effectiveness? Have you found that you got a return for the use of that product? And also, if you haven't, what's prevented you from using a PGR? And obviously, having a good crop is one of those things, right? If you think back to 21, there wasn't a lot of reason to use a PGR because the Mother Nature totally did the work of a PGR, and the fact that we didn't have a lot of height on any sort of crop because we had no bloody moisture. So curious either way, whatever side of this equation you're on, send me your feedback, Haney at RealAgriculture.com. We'll be right back here on Real Ag on the Weekend, here on 980 CGME and 650 CKOM.
Want to get the best out of your soybean crops? Whether you've been growing them for a generation or are just starting into soybeans, find what you need to know at soybeanschool.com. You'll see videos on growing tips, pest control, and much more from specialists across the region, all in one place. Easy for you to access from your desktop, tablet, or mobile phone. Maximize your yields by staying up to date with the Soybean School, presented by BASF, Pride Seeds, and Syngenta Canada.
Before you get back in the field this year, spend some time with the Corn School on RealAgriculture.com. Get all the information you need on hybrid selection, planting depth, crop inputs, and more from a wide range of industry experts. A massive library of video content is available on demand when you need it most. Spend your time outside of the field, inside the classroom, with the Corn School on RealAgriculture.com.
Canada is really being serious about getting in the middle and involving themselves in a pretty significant trade issue between the U.S. and Mexico as it relates to the U.S. exporting GM corn into Mexico. Kelvin Hepner had a chance to talk to Chris Davison of the Canola Council of Canada. Let's listen to the discussion on the why.
I'm Kelvin Hepner for RealAgriculture, and the U.S. Trade Representative has formally requested dispute settlement consultations with Mexico over Mexico's restrictions on agricultural biotechnology, mainly genetically modified corn and how it's used in certain food products in Mexico. Joining us now here on Real Agriculture to discuss why this potentially matters here in Canada is Chris Davison. Chris is the Vice President of Stakeholder and Industry Relations with the Canola Council of Canada. Thanks for taking the time to join us today, Chris.
Hey, thanks for having me, Kelvin. Pleasure to be with you.
So this dispute settlement consultation that the U.S. has now requested with Mexico, there were technical consultations earlier. This is kind of the next step in trying to resolve a trade dispute under the North American Trade Agreement. Why is this of interest here in Canada, Chris?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to start with. And obviously wearing my canola industry hat, probably worth reminding people, although many people are already aware that Mexico is a leading market for Canadian canola and canola-based products. In fact, it's Canada's largest agri-food export to Mexico, and it was valued at approximately $1.6 billion in 2022. So Mexico is very important, as I said, for Canadian canola. And so that's definitely, the point of entry for us into this discussion.
And of course, the vast majority of Canadian canola is genetically modified or genetically engineered. Some might use that terminology. Is there concern, Chris, that the scope in Mexico, that the government's policy there could expand beyond corn, which seems to be the focus so far?
Yes, I'd make a few points. In order to continue to serve a market like Mexico, a valued market, and other key export markets, we need to have regulatory systems that support getting innovations, including those you mentioned, including GM technology, authorized in those markets and into the hands of Canadian canola growers. And so for that, we need clear, predictable science and risk-based approaches to regulation. And that's really where the interest in this file comes from Canada and certainly from our perspective at the Council.
So it's more about paying attention to the big picture, not that you see an imminent issue for canola exports into Mexico.
Well, let me clarify a little bit there. As I said, Mexico is a leading market, and Mexico historically has been one of the world's main importers of GM crops. However, if you go back a few years to about 2018, we started to see that there were challenges with the system in Mexico in terms of a lack of approvals associated with ag biotechnology. And while more recently the decrees from Mexico have been focused on GM corn, we did see adjacent impacts or changes in the Mexican regulatory system as it related to reviews and approvals of products of ag biotechnology that went beyond corn. They included other crops and commodities. And of course, Mexico is one of those markets where we want to have GM canola events approved. And so we end up being caught up in that as well.
Was canola mentioned in any of those documents or those proposals that you're referring to?
Not by name in the decrees that were talked about, but there is concern, as I said, that we've had challenges to regulatory predictability across multiple crops in Mexico over the last few years. And if we don't have those approaches that are grounded in sound science, as I said earlier, we risk stifling access to innovations that farmers need. And we need those innovations to do multiple things. Obviously, we've got demand for canola in our case on a global basis. We've got food security challenges. We have climate-related production issues. And then we have issues, of course, of wanting to, underscoring all that, remain competitive and profitable for Canadian canola, starting with producers and for the whole industry. And so, we need to have that essential predictability and implementation of science-based regulatory systems that are going to enable getting those innovations, including products of ag biotechnology, authorized and approved and into the hands of Canadian canola growers. And so that's where the interest comes from. The decrees more explicitly were focused on corn, but there were clearly adjacent issues associated with Mexico's regulatory system.
One of those adjacent issues I'm assuming you might be referring to is also the phasing out of glyphosate use potentially in Mexico. Is that something that would be of concern for us here in Canada exporting into the Mexican market?
So I think there's a couple of different issues there. I think Mexico, what they're looking at there is domestically, what do they do in terms of use of glyphosate on crops produced in Mexico? But to the extent, if I come back to the ag biotechnology, that you have trait technologies that may have glyphosate tolerance built into them, if they're not receiving approvals in key export markets, then our ability to have those commercialized and put in the hands of Canadian canola growers is where the issue comes in.
Okay, that makes sense. We have seen, again, the U.S. government launch this request for dispute settlement consultations. The Canadian government has the option to sign on as a third party in this process. Do you believe the Canadian government should do that, should move ahead in that direction?
Yes, let me say a couple things about that. Recently there have been some positive signals from Mexico through these previous discussions that have gone on and through other forums that have taken place. You referred to the technical consultations that happened at the end of March. So there have been some positive signals, but we believe there's a need for some more formal and substantive assurance that's required to provide clarity and certainty about the regulatory approach moving forward. In the absence of that, I think there's a concern out there that similar issues could arise in the future, and or you have this sort of precedence established for approaches that are not based on science. So while we're encouraged by the positive signals, we think there's a need for more formal and substantive assurance regarding the situation moving forward.
So would that come about through this dispute settlement consultation process, kind of the next step in that process under the North American Trade Agreement in resolving these types of disputes?
Yeah, so that's the avenue, as you alluded to, that's been opened up now with the decision by the Office of the United States Trade Representative last Friday. And so, as you alluded to, third parties to the agreement, in this case, Canada is the third party, has 7 days to indicate their interest in the matter and their participation. And so we would expect to hear in the next couple of days before the end of this week from the government of Canada regarding what that looks like in terms of those next steps.
Okay. Minister Ng's office told us yesterday that the government is still weighing its decision, still considering whether or not to join as a third party. Have you heard any word beyond that, or are you still waiting to hear that direction as well?
No, we have not heard anything on that front, but we do know, as we said, the provisions in the agreement mean that decision needs to be taken within 7 days from the time the U.S. provided that indication. So between now and end of day Friday, we would look for some direction from the federal government on that front.
All right. Overall, then, just as a final question or window or opportunity to comment here, Chris, maybe speak to the importance of, again, maintaining this market access and addressing non-tariff barriers, potential non-tariff barriers, all the types of issues that you're working on at the Canola Council.
Yeah, I think, as I said, it comes down to having key export markets like Mexico that are key trading partners that are supporting and implementing those science-based regulatory systems that are going to continue to ensure that we get the investments from the companies into R&D, which ultimately, results in innovations, including these products of ag biotech, that we're going to get them authorized and approved in the key markets of interest to us, and then in the hands of Canadian canola growers. And I cannot stress the importance of that innovation agenda to meet both the opportunities and the challenges, some of which I alluded to earlier, things around food security, whether we've got climate-related production issues, remaining competitive and profitable at the farm level.
That was RealAgriculture's Kelvin Hepner talking to Chris Davison of the Canola Council of Canada. I think explaining very clearly why Canada's getting potentially involved and why they are so concerned in this era of some countries not referring to science when it comes to trade. Hey, that's all the time we have today for Real Ag on the Weekend. Thanks a lot for tuning in here on 980 CGME and 650 CKOM. I'm Shaun Haney of RealAgriculture.com, and we'll chat with you again next week. Cheers, everybody.